The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture houses extensive documentation of the Underground Railroad and the networks that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. But some of the most remarkable stories involve ordinary people, poor farmers, working-class families, individuals with little money or power, who risked everything to help fugitives despite having almost nothing themselves to give. On a morning in November 2024, historian Dr. Sarah Mitchell opens a package that will lead her to uncover one of the most moving and complex stories of assistance to fugitive slaves. A case where a poor white farmer in Kentucky sheltered two escaped enslaved women, then faced an impossible choice when slave hunters arrived offering him a substantial reward to betray the women he had protected. A choice that would reveal both the moral courage of ordinary people and the devastating economic pressures that made such courage extraordinarily difficult. The donation comes from a historical society in Kentucky that has been researching Underground Railroad activity in the state. The letter explains that while examining materials from a family that lived in rural Kentucky in the 1850s, researchers discovered a photograph, correspondence, and a journal that document a case where a poor farmer helped two fugitive enslaved women, then faced severe consequences for his choice. Sarah carefully removes the materials from their archival box. The first item is a photograph, styled like a mid-19th century field exposure, showing two barefoot black women standing side by side in front of a rough-hewn log cabin. Both women appear to be in their late teens or early 20s, and their dresses, thin, sun-bleached and shredded at the hems, hang loosely, revealing the harshness of their conditions. The taller woman stands expressionless, her gaze fixed forward. The shorter woman rests a hand lightly on the taller woman's arm, a gesture that seems less like affection than like mutual support. Two people holding each other upright because no one else will. Behind them, standing in the doorway of the small cabin, is a white man in work trousers, vest, and shirt sleeves, one hand resting casually on the doorframe. His posture is relaxed, neither smiling nor scowling, simply watching. The background stretches into an empty field under a washed-out sky, creating a stark sense of isolation. What strikes Sarah most powerfully is the women's expressions, serious, unblinking, suggesting endurance rather than despair. These are faces that have learned to suppress reaction because reaction grants nothing. And their positioning, standing outside the cabin while the man stands in the doorway, suggests the complex power dynamics even within situations where help is being offered. Sarah turns the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, Hannah and Rachel, fugitive slaves from Tennessee, with Thomas Weaver, Kentucky, October 1855. Weaver, a poor farmer, sheltered the women after they escaped. The next day, slave hunters arrived offering $300 reward if Weaver would surrender the women. Weaver refused, despite his desperate poverty. The women eventually reached freedom in Canada. And below that, in different handwriting, added much later, Thomas Weaver owned 15 acres and lived in poverty. $300 was more than 2 years' income for him. He chose principle over survival and paid a severe price for his choice. But Hannah and Rachel lived free. Sarah reads the inscription 3 times, her throat tight. Thomas Weaver, a poor farmer with almost nothing, had been offered $300 over 2 years of income for someone in his circumstances to betray 2 fugitive enslaved women he had sheltered. He had refused despite his desperate poverty, allowing the women to escape to freedom, and had apparently suffered severe consequences for his choice. Sarah spends the rest of that day examining the other materials in the package. What she finds allows her to piece together a complete account of what happened in October 1855 in rural Kentucky. A story of courage, impossible choices, and the extraordinary moral strength required to help others when doing so meant sacrificing one's own survival. From Thomas Weaver's own journal, Sarah finds his account of what happened, written years after the events. My name is Thomas Weaver. I am writing this account in 1870, 15 years after the events I will describe, so that my children and grandchildren will understand what happened and why I made the choices I made. In October 1855, I was 32 years old and farming 15 acres of poor land in rural Kentucky. I lived alone in a small log cabin. I had been married, but my wife died in childbirth 3 years earlier, along with our infant son. I had no other family. I was struggling to survive on my small farm, growing just enough to feed myself and occasionally selling surplus vegetables for minimal cash. I was poor, desperately poor. I often went to bed hungry. My clothes were worn and patched. I had no horse or ox, only my own labor to work my fields. I was one bad harvest away from losing my land and becoming a vagrant. On the morning of October 15th, 1855, I was working in my field when I saw 2 women approaching from the woods. As they came closer, I could see they were Negro women, young, perhaps 18 or 20 years old. They were dressed in thin dresses that were torn and filthy. They had no shoes. They looked exhausted and terrified. I knew immediately what they were: fugitive slaves running from somewhere, probably Tennessee, which was not far south of my land. I also knew that helping fugitive slaves was illegal under the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Anyone who harbored or assisted fugitive slaves could be fined $1,000 and imprisoned for 6 months. For someone in my financial situation, such a fine would be impossible to pay and would result in my imprisonment and the loss of my land. But when I saw those 2 women, exhausted, terrified, desperate, I could not turn them away. They told me their names were Hannah and Rachel. They were sisters who had been enslaved on a plantation in Tennessee. They had escaped 3 days earlier and had been traveling north through woods and fields, hiding during the day and moving at night. They were trying to reach the Ohio River, which they believed was still many days' travel north. They asked if I could spare any food and if I knew which direction they should travel. I made a decision in that moment that would change my life. I told them they could shelter in my cabin. I gave them what food I had: cornbread, some vegetables from my garden, water. I told them they could rest for the day and continue their journey that night when it would be safer to travel. Hannah and Rachel were grateful, but also wary. They asked if I would turn them in for the reward. I told them I would not, that I believed slavery was wrong, and that I would help them reach freedom if I could. They rested in my cabin that day. I gave them my blankets to sleep on while I continued working in my field, though I kept watch for any sign of slave catchers or patrols. As evening approached, I began planning how to direct them north toward the Ohio River and possible help from people who were part of the network that assisted fugitive slaves. But the next morning, October 16th, everything changed. I woke to the sound of horses. I looked out my cabin door and saw 3 men on horseback approaching my property. I recognized one of them, a man named Garrett, who was known in the region as a slave catcher. My heart sank. Somehow, they had tracked Hannah and Rachel to my property. I woke the women and told them to hide in the small root cellar beneath my cabin floor. They squeezed into that small space, and I covered the entrance with a board and a rug. Then I went outside to face the slave catchers. Garrett and his two companions dismounted. Garrett was a large man, intimidating, known for his brutality in capturing fugitive slaves and returning them to their owners. He asked if I had seen 2 Negro women. I said I had not. Garrett didn't believe me. He said they had tracked the women to this area and that my property was the only dwelling for miles. He said he was going to search my cabin. I told him he had no right to search my property without cause. Garrett laughed. He said under the fugitive slave law, he had every right to search for escaped slaves, and that if I interfered, I would be arrested for obstruction. He and his men pushed past me and entered my cabin. I stood outside, praying they wouldn't find the root cellar entrance. I could hear them inside, moving furniture, opening the few containers I owned. After several minutes, they came back outside. Garrett looked frustrated, but not defeated. He stood in front of me and made an offer that I will never forget. He said, "I know those women are here somewhere. Their owner is offering $300 reward for their return, $150 for each woman. That's more money than a man like you will see in 2 years. You're barely surviving on this worthless piece of land. $300 could change your life. You could buy proper equipment, maybe even expand your farm. All you have to do is tell me where they are." I stood there, understanding the full weight of what he was offering me. $300 was indeed more than 2 years' income for me. It was more money than I had ever possessed at one time. With $300, I could buy a horse and plow. I could purchase better seed. I could repair my cabin properly. I could have enough food to last through winter without hunger. It was a fortune to someone in my circumstances. And all I had to do was betray 2 terrified young women who had asked me for help. I looked at Garrett and said, "I told you I haven't seen any Negro women. You've searched my property and found nothing. Now get off my land." Garrett's expression turned cold. He said, "You're making a foolish choice, Weaver. You're choosing niggers over your own survival. You'll regret this. When winter comes and you're starving, remember, you could have had $300. When you lose this land because you can't pay your debts, remember you chose to help runaway slaves instead of helping yourself." Garrett and his men mounted their horses and rode away. But I knew they would be back. They would watch my property. They would wait for Hannah and Rachel to emerge. I went back into the cabin and helped the women out of the root cellar. I told them what had happened, told them about the reward and Garrett's offer. Hannah looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "You could have had $300. You could have ended your poverty. Why didn't you take it?" I told her, "Because selling you would have meant selling my soul. I'd rather be poor and able to look myself in the mirror than be rich knowing I'd betrayed people who trusted me." But I also knew we had a serious problem. Garrett and his men would be watching. Hannah and Rachel couldn't simply walk away from my property. They'd be captured immediately. We needed a plan. Sarah reads more of Thomas Weaver's journal, following his account of how he helped Hannah and Rachel escape, despite the slave catchers' surveillance. I spent that day considering our options. My property was being watched, but there were sympathizers in the region, people who opposed slavery, and who might be willing to help. I knew of a Quaker family about 15 miles north who were known to assist fugitive slaves, though one had to be careful about asking directly, since the work was dangerous and illegal. That night, I left my cabin openly, making a show of going to visit a neighbor to borrow tools. I walked to the Quaker family's farm and quietly explained the situation. They agreed to help. We arranged that the following night they would send a wagon to a location about 2 miles north of my property. If I could get Hannah and Rachel to that location, the Quakers would hide them in the wagon and transport them further north toward the Ohio River. The next night, October 17th, I helped Hannah and Rachel leave my cabin through the back window. We moved through the woods, avoiding open areas where we might be spotted by the slave catchers I knew were watching my property. It took us nearly 3 hours to travel 2 miles, moving slowly and carefully in the darkness. We reached the meeting point. The Quaker family's wagon was there. Hannah and Rachel climbed into the wagon and were hidden under hay and blankets. I said goodbye to them, knowing I would probably never learn what became of them. Before they left, Rachel gave me something, a small cloth bundle. She said it contained the only possession she had managed to bring with her when she escaped. She said she wanted me to have it as thanks for helping them, despite the cost to myself. I tried to refuse, but she insisted. After the wagon left, I opened the bundle. Inside was a small Bible, clearly very old and much read. On the inside cover was written, "To Rachel, from Mother, 1850. May God keep you and bring you to freedom." I kept that Bible. I still have it today, 15 years later. It reminds me of Hannah and Rachel, and of the choice I made to help them even though it cost me dearly. Sarah finds documentation of what Thomas Weaver's choice cost him. From court records and local newspaper accounts, she discovers that Thomas Weaver faced severe retaliation for his refusal to turn in Hannah and Rachel. From a Kentucky newspaper, November 1855, local farmer charged under fugitive slave law. Thomas Weaver of rural Kentucky has been charged with harboring fugitive slaves in violation of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Weaver is accused of sheltering 2 Negro women who escaped from a plantation in Tennessee in October. When slave catchers offered Weaver a $300 reward to surrender the fugitives, Weaver refused and allegedly assisted in their escape. Weaver faces a fine of $1,000 and 6 months' imprisonment. As Weaver is known to be a man of limited means who cannot pay such a fine, he will likely face imprisonment and loss of his property. From court records, Sarah finds that Thomas Weaver was indeed prosecuted, though the case was eventually dismissed on a technicality. The prosecution could not conclusively prove that Weaver had actively assisted the fugitives rather than simply failing to report their presence. But the damage had been done. The legal expenses bankrupted Weaver. He lost his 15 acres of land to creditors and was forced to work as a hired laborer on other people's farms for years afterward. From Thomas Weaver's journal, written years later, I lost everything: my land, my cabin, my independence. For several years after helping Hannah and Rachel, I worked as a hired hand on other people's farms, living in their barns, eating their leftover food, having nothing of my own. Was it worth it? People asked me that question many times. Some called me a fool for refusing $300 that would have changed my life. Others said I was a traitor to my race for helping Negro fugitives. But I never regretted my choice. I would rather be poor and free of guilt than wealthy knowing I had sold 2 terrified young women back into slavery. I would rather lose everything material than lose my humanity. I heard, years later, through the networks of people who assisted fugitives, that Hannah and Rachel reached Canada safely. They settled in a freedmen's community there, married, had children, lived free lives. Knowing they escaped and lived in freedom made every sacrifice worthwhile. In 1868, after the war ended and slavery was abolished, I received a letter. It was from Rachel. She had tracked me down through people who remembered my name from the assistance networks. She wrote to thank me for helping her and Hannah when they were desperate fugitives. She said she had never forgotten that I chose to help them even though it cost me everything. She said she wanted me to know that she and Hannah were alive, were free, and would never forget me. That letter meant more to me than $300 ever could have. Sarah contacts Dr. Marcus Williams, a historian at the University of Kentucky, who specializes in the Underground Railroad in Kentucky and the individuals who helped fugitive slaves despite severe legal and economic consequences. Marcus has spent decades researching people like Thomas Weaver, ordinary individuals with little money or power who chose to help despite enormous personal cost. Marcus calls her back within an hour. Thomas Weaver's story represents one of the most difficult aspects of Underground Railroad assistance. The fact that many of the people who helped fugitive slaves were themselves desperately poor and were being asked to sacrifice their own survival to help others. Wealthy abolitionists could afford to take risks, but people like Weaver were risking everything. Send me everything you have. Sarah shares all her materials with Marcus. They arrange to meet at the Kentucky Historical Society to examine court records, newspaper accounts, and any additional documentation about Thomas Weaver, Hannah, Rachel, and the slave catchers who hunted them. Over the following weeks, Sarah and Marcus piece together the complete story. They find that Hannah and Rachel were sisters who had been enslaved on a plantation in Tennessee. According to later testimony they gave in Canada, they had escaped because their owner intended to sell them separately. Hannah to a plantation in Alabama, Rachel to a buyer in Mississippi. Rather than be separated, they had chosen to run, knowing they would likely be killed if caught. They find records showing that the slave catchers who tracked Hannah and Rachel to Thomas Weaver's property were acting on behalf of the Tennessee plantation owner, who had offered $300 reward for their return, $150 per woman, a substantial sum that indicated the owner was determined to recapture them. They find documentation of Thomas Weaver's prosecution, his bankruptcy, and his years working as a hired laborer after losing his property. They also find evidence that Weaver was shunned by many in his community for helping fugitive slaves. People refused to hire him, refused to do business with him, treated him as a pariah for choosing to help black fugitives over his own economic interests. But they also find evidence that Weaver maintained contact with the network of people who assisted fugitive slaves, and that despite his poverty, he continued to help when he could, sometimes providing food or directions to fugitives passing through the area. Most remarkably, Sarah and Marcus trace what happened to Hannah and Rachel. Using Canadian census records and church records from freedmen's communities in Canada, they find both women listed in the 1861 Canadian census, living in a settlement near Toronto. Records show that both married, both had children, both lived into old age as free women, and they find the letter Rachel sent to Thomas Weaver in 1868. The letter is preserved in the Weaver family papers. Dear Mr. Weaver, my name is Rachel Freeman, formerly just Rachel, enslaved. You may remember me and my sister Hannah. In October 1855, we came to your property in Kentucky as fugitive slaves running from Tennessee. You sheltered us, fed us, and helped us escape, even though slave catchers offered you $300 to betray us. I am writing to tell you that Hannah and I reached Canada safely. We have lived here in freedom for 13 years now. I am married and have 3 children. Hannah is also married with 2 children. We have built lives here that would have been impossible in slavery. I heard, through people who knew you, that you lost your land and everything you owned because you helped us. I heard that you were prosecuted and that the legal expenses bankrupted you. I heard that you worked for years as a hired laborer and lived in poverty. Hannah and I have never forgotten what you did for us. You were offered $300, more than 2 years' income for you, to surrender us. You were desperately poor, struggling to survive, and $300 could have changed your life. But you refused. You chose our freedom over your own survival. I want you to know that we think of you often. I want you to know that the freedom you helped us reach has allowed us to live, to marry, to have children who were born free. I want you to know that everything good in my life, my husband, my children, my freedom, exists because you made the choice you made in October 1855. I also want you to know that slavery has been abolished. The war is over. The evil system that forced us to run and that punished you for helping us no longer exists. You can live knowing that your sacrifice contributed to that freedom. I pray that God will bless you and that you will prosper now that the war is over and justice has prevailed. I pray that you will always know that you saved 2 lives and that we will never forget you. With eternal gratitude, Rachel Freeman. Sarah and Marcus work to create an exhibition that honors Thomas Weaver's courage, while honestly documenting the impossible economic pressures that made his choice so difficult and so costly. They locate descendants of Thomas Weaver. He eventually remarried and had children after the war, and descendants of Rachel Freeman living in Canada who have family stories about their ancestors' escape from slavery and the poor white farmer who helped her. 16 months after Sarah first opened that package, the Smithsonian opens the exhibition, The Choice, Thomas Weaver, and the Impossible Decision Between Survival and Principle. The exhibition occupies a gallery designed to explore the moral complexity of Underground Railroad assistance, particularly the challenges faced by poor people who were asked to sacrifice their own survival to help others. The centerpiece is the photograph of Hannah and Rachel standing with Thomas Weaver outside his cabin, an image that documents the moment before their escape and the consequences of Weaver's choice. A detailed explanation accompanies the image. This photograph from October 1855 shows Hannah and Rachel, fugitive slaves from Tennessee, with Thomas Weaver, a poor Kentucky farmer who sheltered them. The day after this photograph was taken, slave hunters arrived offering Weaver $300, more than 2 years' income, to betray the women. Weaver refused despite his desperate poverty. Hannah and Rachel escaped to Canada and lived in freedom. Weaver lost everything: his land, his home, his independence, because of his choice to help them. The exhibition tells Thomas Weaver's complete story through his journal, court records, correspondence, and testimony from Hannah and Rachel given in Canada years later. It doesn't romanticize Weaver's choice. It honestly documents how difficult the decision was, how much $300 meant to someone in his circumstances, and how severely he was punished for choosing principle over survival. One section displays the economic reality of Weaver's situation, records showing his 15 acres of poor land, his minimal income, the poverty he lived in. The exhibition calculates what $300 would have meant to him. 2 years of income, enough to buy equipment that would have transformed his farming operation, enough to escape poverty. The section makes clear that Weaver's choice was not easy or simple. It was choosing between his own survival and 2 strangers' freedom. Another section examines the consequences Weaver faced: the prosecution, the bankruptcy, the loss of his land, the years working as a hired laborer, the social ostracism. Court records, newspaper accounts, and Weaver's own journal entries document how completely his life was destroyed by his choice to help Hannah and Rachel. The exhibition traces Hannah and Rachel's journey to freedom, their escape from Tennessee, their arrival at Weaver's property, their hiding from slave catchers, their escape to the meeting point with Quaker assistance, their journey to the Ohio River and across into free territory, their eventual arrival in Canada. Census records and church records document their lives in Canada. Marriages, children, decades of freedom. A section on correspondence displays Rachel's 1868 letter to Thomas Weaver, showing her gratitude and her desire for him to know that his sacrifice had enabled her and Hannah to live free, full lives. The exhibition also provides context about other poor white Southerners who helped fugitive slaves despite severe economic consequences, showing that Thomas Weaver's story was not unique. Many poor people made similar choices, often paying terrible prices for their assistance. A video plays continuously featuring historians discussing the moral complexity of Underground Railroad assistance, the particular challenges faced by poor people who were asked to help despite having little themselves, and the significance of people like Thomas Weaver who chose principle over survival. On opening day, Sarah stands in the gallery watching visitors engage with the exhibition. She sees people study the photograph, understanding the weight of the moment it captures. Fugitive slaves, and the man who would soon choose to help them, despite knowing what it would cost him. Marcus stands beside her, looking at the image. Thomas Weaver was 32 years old, desperately poor, struggling to survive on 15 acres of bad land. When slave catchers offered him $300, more than 2 years' income, he refused. He knew refusing would destroy him financially, knew he'd lose everything, and he refused anyway. That's extraordinary moral courage. Not many people would make that choice. Not many people would choose principle over survival when the choice is that stark. A young black woman who identifies herself as a descendant of Rachel Freeman approaches them, emotion clear on her face. My great-great-great-grandmother Rachel escaped slavery in 1855 with her sister Hannah. Family stories always said a poor white farmer helped them even though it cost him everything. Seeing this exhibition, reading Thomas Weaver's journal, seeing the documentation of what he sacrificed, it's overwhelming. He lost his land, his home, everything he owned because he helped my ancestors. Rachel wrote to him in 1868 to thank him. That letter has been treasured in our family for generations. We've never forgotten that a poor man with almost nothing gave up everything so my ancestors could be free. An elderly white man stops to read about the $300 reward for a long time. I've done the calculations, he says. $300 in 1855 is equivalent to about $10,000 today. For someone living in poverty, that's life-changing money. And Weaver turned it down to protect 2 fugitive slaves he'd just met. That's choosing principle over survival, in the most literal sense. I don't know if I would have the courage to make that choice. A middle-aged black man approaches Sarah and Marcus. "This exhibition shows something important," he says. "Not all white Southerners supported slavery. Not all white people chose self-interest over justice. Thomas Weaver was poor, was struggling, had every economic incentive to betray Hannah and Rachel. But he didn't. He chose to help them even though it destroyed his life. That choice deserves to be remembered and honored." Stories like this complicate our understanding of the past. They show that moral courage existed even in terrible circumstances, that ordinary people sometimes made extraordinary choices. Throughout the day, visitors engage deeply with the exhibition, understanding that Thomas Weaver's story represents the moral complexity of resistance to slavery, that helping enslaved people escape often meant terrible sacrifices, that poor people who helped faced consequences that wealthy abolitionists might avoid, and that choosing principle over survival required courage that few possessed. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Sarah walks through the gallery one more time. She stops in front of the photograph, looking at Hannah and Rachel's enduring expressions, at Thomas Weaver standing in his cabin doorway. She thinks about October 1855, two young women desperate and terrified, arriving at a poor farmer's cabin asking for help. A man who had almost nothing being asked to give everything. Slave catchers arriving the next day offering $300, a fortune to someone in Weaver's circumstances, to betray the women he'd sheltered. She thinks about the choice Weaver made, refusing $300, helping Hannah and Rachel escape, then losing his land, his home, his independence because of that choice. Working for years as a hired laborer, living in poverty, facing ostracism from his community, but maintaining his principle that no amount of money was worth selling two human beings back into slavery. And she thinks about Hannah and Rachel, reaching Canada, living in freedom for decades, marrying, having children who were born free, writing in 1868 to thank the man who had sacrificed everything to help them. The photograph waited 169 years to tell its full story. The image that shows two fugitive slaves and the poor farmer who sheltered them has become testimony to moral courage, to the choice between survival and principle, and to the extraordinary sacrifice that resistance to slavery sometimes required. Now the photograph and exhibition have fulfilled a purpose that honors all three people in the image. Thomas Weaver's impossible choice has been documented and celebrated. Hannah and Rachel's courage in escaping and their gratitude for help received has been preserved. And future generations can understand that resistance to slavery took many forms and often required sacrifices that we can barely imagine. As visitors file past the image one last time, many stopping to look at the three figures and think about the choice that was made the day after this photograph was taken, Sarah reflects on all the other ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, all the other individuals who sacrificed their own survival to help others, all the other stories of moral courage that deserve to be documented and honored. Thomas Weaver, born 1823, poor Kentucky farmer with 15 acres, sheltered fugitive slaves Hannah and Rachel in October 1855, refused $300 reward to betray them, despite desperate poverty, helped them escape to freedom, lost his land and everything he owned as consequence of his choice, worked for years as hired laborer in poverty, eventually rebuilt his life after the war, received a letter in 1868 from Rachel thanking him and telling him she and Hannah lived in freedom, died 1889, knowing his sacrifice had enabled two people to live free lives. His story has been told. His courage has been honored. And Sarah is grateful to have played a part in ensuring that Thomas Weaver is remembered as someone who faced an impossible choice between survival and principle, and chose principle, who lost everything material but kept his humanity, and who helped 2 young women reach freedom, even though the cost was the destruction of his own life.